Hey, welcome to Film Fanatics. We are three film geeks discussing movies both new and old. My name is Dan.
My name is Justin.
And my name is Joe.
This week we're going to delve into the horror genre a bit and discuss a few recent horror films, including the new release Insidious Chapter 2. And keeping with the theme, our new classic this week is the 2012 Ethan Hawke film Sinister, and our old classic is 2009's Orphan. As such, our top 5 this week is one Justin came up with, our favorite supernatural horror films. We're also going to talk about some other new releases, and our Oscar nominee A to Z film this week is About Schmidt, starring Jack Nicholson. Before we get started, though, a film that we all enjoyed, some of us more than others, Joe and I think specifically a little more than Justin, Star Trek Into Darkness got its DVD and Blu-ray debut this past week, and some fans are crying foul that to get all of the movie's bonus features, you have to buy copies of the film from different retailers, essentially paying for the film more than once. And I wanted to pick your guys' brains about this because check this out. The movie itself, if you get it on Blu-ray, comes with about 40 minutes of featurettes. But obviously most Trek fans want to have the whole thing. So Target has an additional half hour of features. Best Buy has a couple things too, but you have to access them through an online service they have called Cinema Now, which you then have to get a subscription to if you don't already have one. And then there's the commentary, which is only available as an iTunes download. So you can get a code for the download with retail copies of the Blu-ray, so you don't have to actually buy it a third time, but it's a complete picture-in-picture video commentary, so you have to watch it on your computer screen. It all seems a little bit ridiculous. I mean, I don't personally see what good it is to have a great commentary like that you can't watch on your TV, or to have so many bonus features. I mean, obviously Paramount knows Trek fans want everything. So, I mean, Joe, what are your thoughts on this whole thing?
I agree. I think it's a little ridiculous. I do understand they're trying to give these retailers different options to make more finances and just gain more money in general. But really, I think that they should really just have a particular box set or something with all the features available, just because obviously Trek fans are going to buy it. I agree with you. I don't really understand it at all. I think it's really ridiculous that one particular feature is an iTunes download. Not everybody has iTunes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just kind of being insensitive, I think, to everybody's needs.
Yeah, that's just like the Cinema Now. If you don't have an iTunes account, you have to then, download iTunes and register. And
nobody really has the money to go around and just subscribe to all these different areas to get this stuff.
Right. Justin, what do you think?
I think it's completely taking advantage of the consumer market for Trek fans. I can understand the purpose of trying to make money, but there's a point where you're just making people jump through way too many hoops for something that isn't really needed. If they wanted to do this, I think they should just add one big DVD and charge a little bit extra for it. I don't think it's fair at all to make them pay several times over for things that, admittedly, most of us don't think about, but for Trek fans, it really does add up. And to me, that makes no sense when they're going to buy it anyways, so why are you making them do even more to get that much?
And you and I had this same thing come up when Django Unchained came out. You bought it, I believe, at Best Buy?
Correct.
And I bought it at Walmart, and they had separate features. It wasn't anything too extensive, but it was still, we both had to buy a copy to get the complete collection, which obviously Tarantino fans aren't as obsessive, let's say, as the Trek fans are. But, I feel like, why can't they do the exclusive retailer thing, but then at the same time, maybe through their website or something, do a whole complete box like you guys had said? You pay a little more maybe, but at least you don't have to then buy it multiple times.
What confuses me is that it almost sounds like they don't have enough faith in their product, when obviously Star Trek has always been a big thing with this established fan base. And like you guys said, the fans are going to go buy it. Just give it to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I wonder if, you guys had mentioned something on the show last week or maybe the week before, that in a recent poll, the Trek fans voted Into Darkness as the worst Trek film. But it's still a Trek film, so the Trekkies are going to go buy it regardless. I mean, I'm the same way. If an album comes out by a band I really like, even if it's a crappy album, I'll still plunk down the $10 or $12 to buy it. So is it maybe something like that where Paramount doesn't have a lot of faith in it?
I really find that hard to believe considering how well it did just critically. And honestly,
That's true.
Hearing you guys say that, I personally as a Trek fan thought it was pretty good. So I don't really understand that at all.
Yeah. All right. Well, just wanted to get your guys' opinions on that. I think it's a little silly. Hopefully we don't see too much more of that.
Yeah.
Now, since a lot of this episode is based in the horror genre, our first new release we're going to tackle is Insidious Chapter 2. The movie has an opening weekend of over $41 million, which is more than 3 times the opening of the original from a couple years ago, which only made $54 million in its whole run. It's the second highest September opening ever, just behind, believe it or not, Hotel Transylvania. And it's also on par with this summer's Conjuring, which is currently standing at $135 million and counting. So obviously expectations for Insidious Chapter 2 were pretty high. But does it stack up to the hype? Now, Joe, you just came from it, so let's hear from you first on this one.
All right. Well, I did indeed just see it, and I have to say that for the first about half an hour, 45 minutes of the film, even though a lot was apparently happening, I found myself very bored and honestly kind of laughing at certain points. The film seemed like it was trying way too hard to me. There were admittedly some scary moments. There were some jump scares throughout the film. I'm going to admit that I did find myself scared a few times, but I also kind of felt this really corny element in the film as well. It just seemed like it was going incredibly off and on between being legitimately scary, being kind of funny, but not having the strong element of creepiness that the original had. I just thought it was permeated. And I was really just trying to compare it to the original in that sense. Just the overall tone didn't quite match up. I thought that the story did have a lot of interesting elements. Kind of the origin of the ghost in particular I did find interesting. But the rules of the astral projection traveling weren't quite as well established, I think. And I just found a lot of elements of the plot kind of confusing, particularly who was in control of what spirits were here, and admittedly, my favorite part of the film was probably just the ghost hunters interacting and learning some of the little fun aspects regarding the seances and whatnot. I just thought that was kind of cool. And I thought that the film's cinematography was really great and the music was good. I mean, it was decent overall, I guess, but admittedly, it was something that I felt that I could have easily lived without seeing. It did disappoint me. I gave it a C-.
Wow. And what did you give the first one?
The first one was an A-.
Okay, interesting. I definitely thought it was not nearly as good as the first one. I gave the first one a solid A. It was in my top 20 for 2011. What I found interesting was, if you didn't see the first one, which I saw the film with 2 guys that had not seen the first one and one that had, like myself, it just seemed like it was super confusing. You didn't know what was going on. And I even saw the first one and was still a little bit like, okay, so this part came up in the and I've seen the first one twice, so it's not like I just saw it one time 2 years ago and don't really remember it.
Good movie.
It is a good movie, and I remember it quite well. So for me, even it was a mite confusing. I was very glad that they used the same family and the same actors, because so many movies, especially in the horror genre, since it's a lot of just about the villain, I like that they brought it back to the same exact family, and in fact it takes place pretty much immediately following the first one. I thought that was a really good idea. The producer, Jason Blum, is a pro at this point with what the horror audience wants to see. He created Paranormal Activity. He did Sinister, which, like I said, we'll be talking about a little bit later. He did a movie earlier this year that I enjoyed called Dark Skies. And he was part of The Conjuring, so he knows what horror fans want. But it was a little too inside. And I think if you didn't see the first one, you were completely lost. I thought that one of the twists at the end was super weird. I didn't really understand why they had to put that in there. And I didn't think it was nearly as scary as the original. For me, it was more chilling. I got chills a bunch of times, but there was no part that I was really, jumping out at. The first one, I didn't even see in theater. Both times I saw it on DVD, and it was far more frightening than this one. But what I did think was a little bit weird is just because the story continued and the lore of it continued, and we sort of found more out about these characters and about the demons that they're fighting, it actually made the first one even better, I thought, because it made certain things in the first one that maybe you didn't understand by the end of the movie. They tied it all together in such a way that it really made more sense. So, as a counterpiece to 1, I think it's a B. As a standalone movie, though, I do have to drop it down a little bit just because if you didn't see the first one, I think it would be quite confusing. So my final grade on Insidious Chapter 2 is a B-. Justin?
Oh, wow. I was expecting that to be even lower. For me, I'll be honest, I was not a big fan of the first one. I thought it was good. I didn't think it was great. The sequel, much like Joe and Dan, I did not think was as good. But to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen, I thought it could have been a whole lot worse. I thought the storyline took a long time to get going. I think the main big issue that it had was it tried to cram too much into one movie. I think if this had been branched out into 2, it would have worked so much better. And we would have had time to explore things more in depth so things didn't come off as more confusing or bizarre in some instances. I know Joe brought up the 2 paranormal investigators who I guess were basically comic relief characters. I thought they were introduced way too late, and I thought their humor was really flat and took you out of the story. The best thing that this has going for it is its cinematography is fantastic. It will probably be the last Insidious movie we ever see, but I don't necessarily consider that a bad thing. It was on the right track until about the last 5 minutes where they just felt like they almost didn't want to give it an ending. I sort of felt betrayed. It was like you started out kind of sloppy, then it got okay, and then it went out in the deep end and didn't want to come back. So Insidious Chapter 2 is getting a C+ for me.
All right, so that's not too different from me. Why did you think I would give it lower? Because I did love the first one.
Well, you said as a standalone film, it gets dropped in fair grade, and I was expecting that to head into C territory.
Oh, okay, I understand. I mean, yeah, I didn't think it was that much worse if you hadn't seen the original, but I think it was definitely a little confusing if you hadn't. All right, so our next movie is Blue Jasmine, the latest in the annual Woody Allen Throw It at the Wall and See If It Sticks filmography. He's easily, for me, the most inconsistent director in the last decade or so. He scored really big with Match Point and Midnight in Paris, and then fell really flat with Vicky Cristina Barcelona and last year's absolutely awful To Rome with Love, which I gave an F to. Luckily, Blue Jasmine is more like the former films than the latter one, by a lot. Cate Blanchett plays Jasmine, a recent widower, when her husband, the crooked New York financier played by Alec Baldwin, hangs himself in his jail cell. So she's got no other options, and far away from her rich and cushy lifestyle she's used to, Jasmine moves in with her completely opposite sister in San Fran and tries to start over. I thought Blanchett was so great in this role. And one of the things Woody Allen does so very well, I think, even in his bad movies, is get interesting performances out of actors. Sally Hawkins plays Jasmine's sister, and she is so real and raw in this, in just trying to keep everything together between taking care of her estranged sister and her kids and her boyfriend, trying to make things work with everybody at the same time. And even Andrew Dice Clay, who plays Hawkins' ex-husband and kid's father, is astounding here. You would never expect it, and that, to me, is completely due to Woody Allen's direction, and just probably being in his presence, I think, ups actors' games. In this, the dialogue is never generic. I really, really enjoyed it. My only real complaint on Blue Jasmine is that it's not quite as funny as I would have liked it to be. But if Woody Allen could make whatever movie he has in the pipeline for next year as good as Blue Jasmine, I will be very happy. For me, Blue Jasmine gets an A-. Justin, what do you think of it?
I got to echo you 100% on the fact that this really was a phenomenal performance from Cate Blanchett, and I will be absolutely shocked if she does not get a nomination for this.
Yeah, the Academy loves Woody Allen movies, so I would be shocked as well.
Yeah. Woody Allen's probably also one of the most consistent directors out there. He's often said that he's going to try and churn one out every year because he's got nothing better to do. Personally, I kind of wish he would take his time so he would get less movies like To Rome with Love and more stuff like Midnight in Paris, but he wants to keep busy, and that's his thing, and I respect him for that. To be honest, I thought it was somewhere between good like Match Point and Midnight in Paris and bad like To Rome with Love. I thought it was somewhere in between the two of those. Admittedly, though Cate Blanchett gives a very good performance, she plays one of the most unlikable characters I have ever seen committed to film. At first I felt bad for her. By the end of it, I was just irritated by her, and I couldn't wait for them to finally do something with her that would hopefully change that, but never did.
Doesn't she play the hell out of it, though?
Oh my gosh, yes.
I mean, it's such... And people are like that. People that are rich and don't understand what, middle class is like are that snobby and that just out of their element. So you can't say it wasn't an authentic character. You may have hated her.
No. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that wasn't authentic. That's probably the best thing that I can say about the performance. It's just the fact that they don't ever really give you a reason to like her, and it just keeps hitting the same note over and over and over again. You respect it as much as it frustrates.
Okay.
The other big issue I had was the storyline kind of jumps around, sometimes going before things, sometimes going away from things, focusing on different characters. And it takes a long time for things to bounce back because they're trying to capture the story from a bunch of different angles. And for me, it seemed like it wasn't quite sure of what exactly it wanted to do. To be fair, this is leaps and bounds above To Rome with Love from last year, which was just a complete mess. But it's also got a long way to go from being as good as Midnight in Paris. Overall, if you're looking for a decent Woody Allen movie, this will probably do it for you. Blue Jasmine's getting a B.
I really did like Blue Jasmine, and To Rome with Love, just don't see it. But I do appreciate that he does churn one out every year. I kind of think it's nice that he at least, like I said, it's kind of a throw it at the wall and see what sticks approach. And I'm not saying that it's the best idea, because a lot of the movies aren't great. He doesn't ever need to work again. He doesn't need to make another movie, and his legend is cemented. So I appreciate that he still gets out there and makes one every year. All right, so up next we're going to talk about The Family. And Joe, we're going to start with you for that.
All right. The Family is a film that stars Robert De Niro as a mobster who basically sold out some of his comrades in a mafia family back in New York. And so he and his family are relocated to a small town in France, where they have to deal with trying to assimilate and become wonderful members of society, while also having to deal with their FBI agents who are watching them and trying to avoid being killed by some of the mobsters back home in the States. This film is kind of a dark comedy, though it really feels more like it could have easily been a drama had it been executed, I think, a little more directly. I wasn't really sure what it wanted to do. However, I have to say that overall I did enjoy it. I thought the film had a lot of interesting one-liners. I kind of liked the humor, though I will admit it kind of teetered more into the serious in the last act or so, which I actually thought was pretty good. And I know that in a film like this, it's kind of hard to create these really likable characters, even though they are basically really unlikable. But I think that the film managed to do it. You kind of did get behind these characters. You kind of liked them. I thought all the actors gave really good performances. I enjoyed the action sequences. Really, on the whole, I thought it was a pretty enjoyable experience for me. I gave it a B-.
Okay, Justin?
All right, well, I guess I should kick this off by saying, when this finally ended, these two firmly believe that I absolutely loathed this movie. Nothing could be further from the truth. I will say I was not a big fan of it, but I won't say it was as bad as they thought I made it out to be.
Yeah, I thought that you hated it.
I thought it was like a D.
Like he was,
no.
Like he was ready to go. I thought,
Yeah.
he gave this a big fat F, didn't
Yeah.
No, I was just exhausted that night.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think its biggest issue was, to me, it just felt very underdeveloped. It wanted to be a comedy, but like Joe said, it's very serious, and it seems very cartoonish for an adult-oriented movie with the R rating and a bunch of other things. The dark humor, it comes and goes, and it doesn't really work that particularly well. I thought the slapstick seemed kind of forced, and the villains don't really seem to bring anything to the story. You don't really learn a whole lot about them, and essentially they're just there for a big finale, which I guess they succeed at, but it probably could have been better if we'd actually learned more about them. That said, despite all of these issues, I still found it fairly entertaining. I won't say it was a D, but I'll bring it one letter grade up and leave The Family with a C.
So basically, you thought it was okay.
I thought it was okay. It was really the definition of average.
Yeah, I am with you on that, except slightly less. I mean, I liked some of the stylistic things that were done. I really liked the way they did the transitions from scene to scene. You thought a gun was going to fire, and then it turned into De Niro typing, a letter on the typewriter. Just that kind of stuff I really enjoyed. My favorite part of the movie was actually with the kids at school, specifically Diana Agron, who you might know from Glee. She was really good in this, I thought. And when it started, I didn't feel that way, and then the more her character got developed, I really thought she did a good job. For me, really only the last half hour or so was that engaging. Once we do meet these mobsters that are out to get De Niro and the family. Before that, I was a little bit, not bored maybe, but just a little underwhelmed. The dark comedy stuff, some of it worked for me. I had some giggles here and there. For the most part, I don't enjoy laughing at people who beat a plumber within an ounce of his life because he was a half hour late for the appointment. And in a movie like this, you're supposed to find that hilarious. I kind of didn't. Also, this is sort of a weird thing to nitpick, I guess, but there were some very bizarre music cues in this movie. There was a lot of 80s songs in different scenes that seemed completely out of place. And for a while, I thought it took place in the 80s because of that. But then they mentioned cell phones, so obviously it takes place in present day. So I really didn't think too much of this movie. I thought it was slightly less than you guys did. I gave The Family a D+.
Wow.
Oh, wow. You liked it less than I did.
I did, actually.
That's surprising.
It's surprising enough.
You don't see that too often.
Yeah, wow.
That is for sure. Our final movie is one that Justin and I saw called Short Term 12. Justin?
All right. So Short Term 12 focuses on Grace, who works at a foster facility for troubled children. And it basically chronicles their lives and her own personal struggles in and out of the overall institution. Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, I thought this was one of the most brutally realistic and truthful films this year. I thought it managed to be both funny and then go from that to absolutely heartbreaking and tear-jerking, often within moments of each other. And Brie Larson as Grace just really brought it home. I didn't actually hear about this movie until, I want to say, 3 weeks ago. And it absolutely lives up to the hype. It's one of the best movies of this year. I would be shocked if it doesn't end up in my top 10. Short Term 12 gets an A.
Yeah, I can probably call it right now. It's absolutely going to be in my top 10 and probably top 5 at the end of the year. It was just well written, acted, and directed. It was engaging. It was funny. It was honest. It was blunt. As somebody who has worked and lived with at-risk youth, we took in foster kids pretty much my whole life. The nuances in the characters are so beyond real. The director is a new name, Destin Daniel Cretton. He both wrote and directed Short Term 12, and he just did such a brilliant job with it. I liked that they filmed it with handheld cameras. I thought that was an interesting choice. It really brought you into the action more. And not only is Brie Larson and the other adult actors great, but the child actors are phenomenal. The girl who plays Jaden, you may recognize. I recognized her immediately from one of my favorite recent comedies, Bad Teacher. But based on her performance here, she is definitely one to watch in the next few years. And that is not to take anything away from the other child actors either, because Keith Stanfield and Kevin Hernandez, who are, to my knowledge, complete newcomers. They play Marcus and Lewis, respectively. They're perfection in this. The movie stands at 99% right now on Rotten Tomatoes, and I can completely see why. It is one of 3 movies this year that I give an A+ to, and that's Short Term 12. And that wraps up our new movie section. We're going to move into our top 5 right now, and our top 5 this week is an interesting category called supernatural horror films. And with this, we had sort of a debate on what constitutes a supernatural horror film, and we sort of agreed that alien films maybe are not in the wheelhouse there. Joe, before you tell us your top 5, what can you add to that? I mean, we sort of ruled out alien movies.
Well, even though a lot of times things that are labeled supernatural include aliens because it's something we're unfamiliar with, and I guess realistically speaking hasn't been 100% proven. It's kind of in the unknown, which is basically supernatural. Mm-hmm. In the context of the films, the characters are seeing physical beings they can touch, they can see them. They're there. They are actual beings that there's an idea of certainly what they are, and whereas dealing with some of the more supernatural elements, spirits, demons, things like that, there's a lot more uncertainty. So that's kind of what we were going for.
Why don't we start with you, actually, and why don't you give us your top 5?
Would you like to do all 5 or go around?
I don't know. Let's do 5 to 2, and then we'll go around with our number 1s.
All right, that sounds good. My number 5 is The Deaths of Ian Stone. It's a very interesting film. It basically follows this guy who kind of wakes up every day and just feels like something's kind of off with his life, sort of like The Matrix. And he basically finds that between the cracks of reality, there are these beings that basically feed off people's fear, and they kill him over and over and over again, and he kind of finds a way to fight them throughout the film. It's pretty engaging.
I have not heard of that.
It's kind of an independent film. You guys might not have heard of it. It came out, I think, around 2008 or something like that.
Okay. I heard about it, but I heard a lot of mixed things, and I believe it was from Horrorfest.
Horrorfest, that's right.
Yeah, I've had some winners and I've had a whole lot of losers with Horrorfest. So
I'll be honest, there aren't too many good ones from Horrorfest, honestly. But this one, I think, just for originality and once again tone, which I think is kind of what I'm going for in this list, is just really, really good. It was a really interesting concept. I really liked the character. The only problem I really had with it was the last act, in which it gets kind of corny, but it was still really cool. So the Deaths of Ian Stone was my number 5. My number 4 is probably one you guys have heard of. It's Rosemary's Baby. I think it's just a classic horror movie. Basically, this lady finds that she's gotten involved with a cult, and, well, spoilers, she may have given birth to the devil's spawn. So it's really just an excellent film, and it really grips you. It's my number 4. Number 3 is Wes Craven's They. I think it's kind of an underrated film. I kind of like monsters and creatures that we don't really see, and that's kind of one of the great strengths of the film, is that there's this great sense of danger, and we don't really know what these things are, and it isn't until like the last second of the film that they strike. And the whole film just builds up to that, and I really liked it. The second one is the Blair Witch Project. I just thought that, considering the fact that it was made on such a low budget, it really is one of the few films that really did terrify me and kind of left me thinking about it days afterwards. And I went out into the woods, I think, one of the next days, and I did get a little paranoid as I was walking and didn't think I was getting anywhere. So, yeah, Blair Witch Project was my number 2.
Very good. Now, horror, before I start this, horror is a genre that I'm just recently, maybe over the last 4 or 5 years, getting into on a more regular basis. In fact, there's one movie on my list that put me off of horror movies for several years because it was so frightening and gave me nightmares. But to that end, most of the ones on my list are of the new-ish variety. I've seen very few of the quote-unquote classics. But we'll start with number 5, which is Paranormal Activity 3. It's, for me, the best in the paranormal series. I think that 1 was very scary, 2 was kind of stupid, but 3 is one of the first horror movies that I've ever actually seen in the theater. And I think that may have attributed to the frightening part of it. I thought the idea of putting the handheld camera on a fan was kind of clever, so you could sort of see the action that way.
I thought they got progressively worse from what I heard.
Well, the 4th one was awful.
Okay.
The 4th one is useless, and perhaps why this year there's not one coming out, because the last 4 years we've gotten one every year.
Yeah, I know.
And this year, I mean, maybe because, they've been working on Insidious Chapter 2 and The Conjuring and everything, but for whatever reason there's no Paranormal Activity this year, but 4 was pretty awful.
Okay. And yet we're getting 2 next year, so...
maybe that's why then. They're making up for lost time.
Get 2 in 1 year?
Yeah, okay. Well, that I didn't know, Justin. So I'm glad you said that. Because 4 kind of left me hanging, because it was like... 3 had such a great ending, and then at the start of 4... It led from number 2 to number 4 and completely forgot that 3 existed. So I thought maybe they were doing like an even odd kind of thing, because like 1 and 3 are tied in, 2 and 4 are tied in. Anyway, I thought it was very, very frightening, and so that's my number 5, Paranormal 3. Number 4 is the original Insidious. Both of those movies came out the same year, and they were both in my top 20 for that year. You know, we've already kind of talked about Insidious, so I don't need to go into much more detail with that. But I will say again that after seeing Chapter 2, it makes the original Insidious that much stronger, I think. Number 3 on my list is the one true classic, Poltergeist. This is one of the few horror classics that I have seen. I saw it probably about 5 or 6 years ago in a Halloween theatrical release. It wasn't nearly as scary as Insidious or Paranormal 3, but when you consider the context and the time frame and everything, I can see when this was originally released, it was probably, you know, one of the most terrifying things that's ever been put to film. I thought it still did have some chills and scares with it, and just the characterization is really good in Poltergeist. My number 2 is The Ring, and that is the film that put me off of horror for a good 5 years. My brother and I rented it one night, and I had nightmares the next 2 nights about it. Totally horrifying. I don't think I can ever watch it again, but I remember liking it enough that I definitely gave it an A. It just was a little bit horrifying for me. Justin?
All right, before I begin, I want to say that my list is not necessarily... I didn't grade it on terms of scariness. I made my list in terms of uniqueness and in terms of cultural impact. So I want to begin mine with my honorable mention. I really wanted to put this on my list, and if I had it, probably would have been my number 1. Phantasm. However, the issue with that one is, for anyone that's familiar with the series, the main villain, the tall man, even though they don't outwardly say it, he's basically an alien. However, he does have... his method of going about things is very supernatural. So I was hoping I could do that, but the alien thing sort of got in the way. So I really want to make sure that was an honorable mention. My number 5 is The Ring. I thought the overall concept of the videotape and the way it ties into the actual character itself of Samara was absolutely original and very unique. And I think you can watch the American version or the Japanese version and get generally the same effect from both. The only reason this is so low for me is when The Ring came out, it was advertised as this absolutely terrifying movie, and for Dan, apparently he got that at a complete...
It was. That was truth in advertising for me.
Actually, it was really scary, Justin. I have to admit, when I saw it in theaters too, and I probably didn't enjoy horror much for a few years either. Mm-hmm. It was very good.
Yeah, to be honest, just you talking about the videotape right now kind of freaked me out a little bit, and I'm dead serious.
I promise it's not in real life. Anywho, however, for me, when I finally did get around to seeing it, I think it was a year or 2 after it came out, I didn't hate it. I thought it worked very, very well as a mystery. I didn't think it was that scary as a horror movie. But as Joe and Dan have apparently implied, I am in the minority there.
I thought it was terrifying too.
Yeah, same.
All right, so number 4 for me is Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead. What can I say? The film is a cult classic. In the original trilogy, it's the one that's actually a legitimate horror movie. Evil Dead 2 is a horror comedy, and Army of Darkness is basically an action fantasy with comedic elements. I thought it was really creepy. There are some scenes that still haunt my memories and will probably result in me hitting the fast forward button if I ever watch them again.
He's talking about the trees.
Yes, Joe, I am referring to the trees. That said, I thought the demons were kind of annoying. I had to take aspirin after watching the movie because they gave me a headache. But overall, for the micro budget that it was shot on, very creepy, very original, and I really hope that the rumors are true that Sam Raimi is going to be working on a new one very shortly. Number 3 for me is The Amityville Horror. This is completely disregarding the fact that there was a remake in 2006. I consider that one of the worst movies I've ever seen. It's one of the few haunted house movies where it's not really a house where there's a bunch of creepy ghosts running around in it. The house literally feels like an actual entity. And the way they shoot the house's perspective for things gave me absolute chills watching it over and over and over again. And I thought that was really unique. My number 2 is one that Dan brought up, and it's the main reason Insidious is not on my list. Poltergeist. Don't get me wrong, Insidious is still a good movie. It's just Poltergeist sort of brought us into that world beforehand, and I think did it so much better. Admittedly, it's a little dated for today, but some of the scares are still so relevant and so chilling, and you can definitely see the overall impact that this movie has caused, especially with Insidious both 1 and 2. Steven Spielberg, as executive producer, really brought it home. Much like Evil Dead, there are some scenes in that still I consider horrifying, and as my very first horror movie, I thought it was absolutely terrifying.
Well, it's a more subtle horror movie, too.
It really takes its time.
Yeah, it does. And I guess maybe that was sort of the norm back then, but now it's like, you have to have a scare every 3 or 4 minutes or it gets boring, I guess. And I think Poltergeist really did perfect kind of the slow build on those horror.
That was one of the strengths of The Conjuring, too. Was kind of
like I agree.
A throwback. It really took its time. Like, I think it was almost, maybe like 45 minutes before anything really scary happened?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of the clapping was probably the first scary part. And that was, like a half hour in, maybe.
What, the doll? I thought that was a little...
Well, the doll was creepy, yeah.
Okay, the doll...
No, you're right, the doll was creepy.
It was creepy, but after that, they kind of slowed things down again.
Right, yeah, exactly. All right, so here we go with our number ones. Joe, we're going to start with you.
Well, I guess I kind of picked this one because my favorite horror film of all time would obviously be The Thing, but for reasons that Justin just basically discussed, can't put it on there because The Thing, despite all the weird demonic elements to it, being Lovecraftian inspired, it is basically an alien. And I didn't think that either one of the other slots in John Carpenter's trilogy of Prince of Darkness or Mouths of Madness was really quite as good as that, though I would recommend seeing those as well. They're also excellent. Mine is The Dreams of the Witch House, and I believe it was a more modern retelling of that story. Came out a couple years ago. It was a bit of a shorter film, but I actually really enjoyed it. And basically it takes place around modern times, this particular version, and this gentleman decides to live in this house, and apparently it is cursed. There's this part of the room that is actually a doorway to another realm, and the realm is basically controlled by this demonic entity simply known as the witch, and he has to prevent this woman from basically sacrificing the baby of his neighbor to some horrible demonic cult. And I thought it was incredibly well executed.
That's another one I've not heard of.
I think it had a limited release. I think it's another independent film. I don't know if it's Horror Fest, but it was really good, and I need to dig it up again so I can watch it again. It was
What's
really
the
good.
name of it again?
It was Dreams of the Witch House.
Okay. And what is Horror Fest? Is that the production company, or...?
What is it, Justin? I don't know exactly what it is.
When I first heard about it, it was... they tried to take a bunch of independent films that studios supposedly believed were too shocking to show to general audiences and bring them into your commercial theaters for about a week. Okay. It's since gotten more of a DVD release. I don't know if they're still doing it. I know they got up to at least Horror Fest 3.
Well, my number one has been mentioned before. It's on Joe's top 5. And this is really the first horror movie I ever saw in theaters. I was in college when this came out. It's The Blair Witch Project. And much like Joe, I had a similar experience. The next night, I was driving with my friend back from a concert in Philly, and we were driving through the not through the woods, obviously, but there were woods on basically either side of the car, and I just got super freaked out just thinking about that movie. And really, I think every few years there's a movie that comes along that is a true game changer in its genre. Clerks was one, Pulp Fiction is one. The Blair Witch Project is absolutely groundbreaking in every way for the horror genre. It ushered in basically all of the point of view stuff and the handheld camera stuff, and it helped or launched a new style of marketing. I mean, it was the first really internet marketed hit movie. So just for all of those things and the fact that it was scary as hell, The Blair Witch Project is my number one.
It's funny. I much like The Ring, I didn't think it was that scary when I saw it, but I really thought the subtlety worked for that. My number one is a little bit of a shocker. I'll explain in a second.
Is it Wes Craven's Shocker?
Oh my gosh, no.
Okay.
No.
Could it be Nightmare on Elm Street?
Why'd you have to bring that up?
Sorry.
No. My number one is The Shining. Before I go any further, I do have to apologize for me being a Stephen King fan and considering this my number one. For anyone who doesn't know, Stephen King loathes the Stanley Kubrick version of this, so much so that he helped take part in a TV miniseries that was much more faithful to the book. To be honest with you, I believe both versions are worth watching. But what I like about The Shining is, first of all, with an adaptation, one has to be able to tell the story, but they have to be able to also realize that there are points where you have to find new ways to make it interesting. And I think Kubrick, for the most part, did a very good job of doing that. But the scares are very subtle, they're very surreal. You really get this creepy, atmospheric way that this is taking hold of Jack Nicholson's character, and it's really something freaky. And I thought the same really worked well with the miniseries. I know there are some people that are kind of split on that, but I thought it worked. I thought if you're looking for a much more faithful version, it's still good. And I thought this was just a really well done horror movie that manages to be both stylistically interesting, have a great cultural impact. There's currently a documentary that came out earlier this year called Room 237 that goes heavily into what Kubrick may have been trying to say about The Shining. It's just such a big cult hit that I had to leave it as my number one. There's just so much that this has brought to the horror world and will probably continue to bring for years to come.
Good choice.
It is a good choice. Do you guys get more creeped out with supernatural horror movies, or do you get more creeped out with, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Freddy Krueger, guys running around trying to kill you kind of stuff? For me, it's absolutely supernatural.
I have to agree with you there. I think, like I said, I think it's always more threatening when you don't know and you don't understand what it is that's threatening you. And if it's just some big guy with, some knives or a chainsaw, admittedly that is frightening, but we can kind of grasp to some degree what that is. And I think that when we don't know what it is, the unknown has always been one of the biggest fears. And I think great directors really harness that.
Justin, what do you think?
I think it really depends on the handling. I've been creeped out by both, to be honest with you.
As have I.
Oh, me too.
But I think it really depends on the overall motive and how they're handling the material. Freddy Krueger, the general concept creeps me out, but the fact that he just never shuts up about anything and he almost becomes more funny than actually scary.
Basically, the decline of the franchise.
Exactly. But the general concept of, like, you literally can't escape this guy because we biologically have to sleep is still a chilling concept when you think about it.
If there was a top 10, I'm pretty sure it might have made that for me. I did enjoy it.
It might have for me too. I might have left that as a second honorable mention maybe. But in later years, I've also liked movies that sort of add a little bit more rhyme and reason to the killer, or not necessarily in terms of, like, slashers like Leatherface or
Mike Myers.
Mike Myers is one of my favorites.
Me too.
Just because he's probably the best instance of the fear of the unknown. We know what he wants, but we don't know why he's going after everyone else to get to what he wants.
Which is one reason I thought personally that the first film was a lot more successful than the remake.
Alright, well, we do have two more horror movies to talk about because our new classic this week was the 2012 movie Sinister. I wanted to wash the taste of that horrible movie Getaway out of our mouths and watch a good Ethan Hawke flick, so we put on Sinister last week. Now, he plays a famous real crime writer going through major writer's block, so he moves his family into this house, which another family was recently murdered, hoping that it will spark some inspiration. And at the same time, he wants to help solve the disappearance of the young daughter of the family that was murdered, and she just disappeared without a trace. Now, he doesn't tell his family that they're moving into the murder house, although his wife does suspect that something's up. I really loved this movie. I thought it was completely original. I thought Ethan Hawke was really good in the role, not only as a father, but his character is a really good gumshoe detective. I mean, he has the whole pictures with string connecting them in his office, and it's very, very interesting how everything sort of transpires in the movie. I think the pacing is fantastic from the opening scene, the chilled start. The opening scene is actually showing the family that lived in the house getting murdered, and you don't know that it's them at the time, of course, but you find out, pretty early on. But just the pacing of this movie is so good. It's one that we just sort of talked about, that horror movies these days, you need a jumping scene every 3 or 4 minutes. And here's a movie where it gets put to really good use. Also, I think the killer has a really wicked sense of humor, and I don't know how much detail I want to go into with that, but it's very, very dark, but still kind of funny, even though he is the killer. But yeah, so I really liked this movie. I gave Sinister a B+. Joe, let's go to you.
Well, I just want to say that after viewing this film, I felt that it probably takes the place as my second favorite Ethan Hawke movie.
Really?
Behind Gattaca, I'm guessing. Which will probably always be number one. But really, I just thought this film was really executed just brilliantly. It was pretty much flawless in that regard. And once again, I kind of always go for atmosphere in films anyway, and especially in horror films, it's very important. And this film has such a great atmosphere. Everything just feels so nasty and just creepy. And I really, really enjoyed it. I thought the performances were really good. But I also like the fact that they added on this really interesting dynamic to this kind of struggling writer trying to balance out his life with his family. And there was kind of this feeling of a lack of supernatural throughout most of the film, almost as if he was just kind of uncovering this really gritty, realistic murder mystery, kind of just following this guy's obsession with snuff films, which in and of itself was incredibly creepy, but also kind of down to earth, which is, I think, one of the reasons why this film is so successful. But once those supernatural elements are introduced, I think it adds a whole nother layer of creepiness, and the villain is probably one of the scariest I've ever seen. There's something about him that just really brings this really ominous presence, and the end of the film is kind of dark, and I have to say I thought that besides a few elements with some of these ghost kid characters I thought were a little bit cheesy, on the whole I thought it was a really awesome horror film. And the only reason I didn't put it into my top 5 was because it was very new and I wanted to give it a few years to sink in.
Right.
Because it was really brilliant. I thought it was excellent, and I gave it an A-.
Very nice. And you had not seen that one before, correct?
I had not, and I have to admit, I agree. It was kind of what you said about with the snuff films. The whole film is really dark and scary, but also kind of funny.
Yeah, in a really, creepy way.
It's like a really creepy way, like, you'd run into this guy in the hallway, like, hey there, and it's like, don't kill me, please. You kind of like, hey, maybe you can just, get away from this. So just that sense of being uncomfortable is just something that is, I think, really dynamic and really important to a really successful horror film like this, kind of in keeping with the supernatural vein. And that's one reason I thought it was great.
And he's one of the few, really three-dimensional victims in these horror movies. Like recent movies, The Conjuring, and even a little bit in the Insidious films, he is just a guy. And he develops a drinking problem as a result of, watching these films and trying to solve the murder and the kidnapping, and he delves into a dark place all his own, regardless of anything else.
And that kind of makes it much darker and much more layered.
I completely agree. Justin, what do you think of Sinister?
I thought it was a very unique spin on the found footage genre. It's actually interesting that you brought up Blair Witch Project in terms of one of your scariest, because instead of focusing on just a straight-up POV from the handhelds, we're actually seeing most of the actual horror from the snuff films that Ethan Hawke finds up in the attic. I thought it had some really great elements of creepiness and suspense. It's interesting that that you brought up the concept of, do we like being scared more when we don't know a whole lot, or do we like being scared when we actually have a much more tangible villain? It's interesting in the case of Sinister, because when you don't know a whole lot with the villain in Sinister, he's a lot more terrifying, he's a lot more ominous, and the villain is much more creepy. But the more we find out about him through people that are there to solely give explanation, the more we take out the element. And as Joe mentioned, with bringing in these strange ghosts at one point near the finale, it just seemed goofy more than anything else. It wanted to be kind of like, it wanted to add this new layer, but it just kind of didn't fit. And for me, eventually what could have been really scary just comes out off as more disturbing. I understand that disturbing can often be scary, but this was just disturbing being disturbing. Especially with, as you mentioned, his weird but understandable sense of humor in terms of...
Understandable.
Well, we're understandable in terms of, why this might be considered funny given how he's addressing this.
Okay.
Not necessarily, the overall situation is funny. No. No. Don't get me wrong, ladies and gentlemen.
So you thought once Ethan Hawke contacted the guy from the university and, the paranormal expert or whatever, and he sort of explained who this guy is and why he's doing what he's doing, that sort of made it not as good for you?
A little bit.
Okay.
I mean, the first time around when I saw this, it didn't as much. This time around, it really did, because the creepiest thing about this character is just simply the fact that we don't know anything about him. And then he becomes more tangible, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. The majority of the times we do actually see him before, like, the third act, he's just only on the overall footage. And I think it's so much scarier in terms of how they develop him and how Ethan Hawke tries to learn more about him, which may or may not have been necessary.
See, I thought once you found out more about him, I wouldn't say it made him more scary, because he was already pretty frightening, but just the chain of events then that occurs after that, because of the knowledge that he then has about the character who's called Bagul, I thought that was just very frightening. The fact that, okay, he knows about him, but what is he going to do? What can he do? It was, for me, equally as scary as not knowing anything about him. Joe, where do you stand on that?
Well, I kind of sort of understand where Justin's coming from. I think that, like, kind of trying to keep it grounded and have this mysterious element to the character would have really made it much more scary. But at the same time, there were already kind of established supernatural elements that kind of had to at least be addressed a little bit. So it was kind of necessary.
Yeah, I think that's where I fall on. I do definitely see your point, Justin. But for me, yeah, it was sort of, if the whole movie it went completely unexplained, I don't think it would have been as satisfying.
I think one interesting way they could have taken it, which is sort of the way I was kind of interpreting it in a way, is that Ethan Hawke's kind of stressful nature investigating the situation was kind of building upon his drinking problem, and he might have been hallucinating some of these things and maybe getting kind of torn up into the role almost. And I kind of felt that that was kind of an element that was still there despite some of the discussions about Bagul's origins. Like, that didn't necessarily make it true. And I thought that that was kind of something to keep in mind. So I guess I'm kind of in the middle there. And I think that ambiguity is kind of what made it interesting for me.
But to wrap up my review of Sinister, like I said, I thought it was a good movie. Probably one of the better horror movies that has come out in the past year or so. My only other issue with it came from the fact that the dialogue kind of falls flat in some instances when they give Ethan Hawke this kind of goofy sidekick that helps him find out stuff, who we often hear Ethan Hawke refer to as Detective So-and-so. He just doesn't work. He comes off weird, then ends up making it seem like the entire situation had no way of Ethan Hawke to ever have the upper hand, which to me really left a bad feeling of unsatisfaction to me.
Oh, I totally disagree.
Dan, I just was wondering, because I thought that guy was hilarious.
I thought he was... not only was he hilarious, but he makes sense in the role because of Ethan Hawke's legend as, you know, the writer of this great book and everything. He really looks up to him and wants to help him. And as he says, you know, the reason he gets the name is because, Ethan Hawke, you always... whatever the character's name is that Ethan Hawke's playing, you always dedicate, your book, thanks to Deputy so-and-so for helping me solve this case. And it was this hero worship and part comic relief, like Joe said. And I think it's established early on that he does not have help from the police force in writing this book. He's made the police look bad in some of his other books. And so this guy is kind of his only man on the inside. And because he has that sort of hero worship dynamic, I think it totally works.
And I think it also might have given him an upper hand to some extent, at least a chance. And in a film this dark, you kind of need that. You need that kind of human element to kind of take you out.
Well, see, it kind of has the same problem as Insidious Chapter 2. It gets really, really dark, and then they introduce a comic relief character who should have been there 20 minutes earlier, but instead we're supposed to be really scary now, and there's this guy trying to be funny. It just takes you out of the element to me. I won't deny that he may have been necessary. I completely see where you're coming from there. I just felt there could have been a better way to handle him, so he didn't just feel like a glorified comic relief character.
Well, give us your grade, Justin.
I'm sorry. We keep getting sidetracked.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
It's fine. We need this. Sinister gets a B from me. Still well worth a watch, but a couple minor issues.
The way you talk about it, I thought you were going to give it like a D, man.
No. I mean, yes, it does have some flaws. And yes, we got into some fairly in-depth conversations about this. But no. I really did like this movie.
Oh, man. That's good.
All right, well, let's move on here. We have another horror movie we're going to discuss, and that's Orphan. This was a movie brought to us by a member of our group that does not do the podcast with us, but She got drawn for the old classic slot this week. Her name's Destiny, and she picked Orphan for her very first one. And I think we're going to start with Justin on this one.
Okay, so Orphan focuses on Vera Farmiga, who plays a mother who has recently come back from having a disastrous miscarriage, I believe?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. And is trying to struggle with being a mother and decides that instead of trying to go through childbirth one more time, decides to adopt and meets this girl who seems like the perfect child, but as any horror movie buff knows, things obviously go horribly wrong. And as the tagline suggests, there's something wrong with the young orphan named Esther. Well, unlike Sinister, this just was messy. To be fair, I thought this had a lot of potential. However, it's ruined by bits of melodrama and a lot of exaggeration. It wants to be really gory and creepy and try to do a bunch of different things, a lot of which I don't think pan out the way they wanted them to. There are a lot of bizarre moments that don't even make a whole lot of sense. To give an example, the kids disappear constantly, and for some reason, we're supposed to believe that Vera Farmiga and her husband in the film are completely oblivious to the situation, and it just goes out in left field for me. That and the fact that the 2-hour running time is entirely too long. It just drags and drags and drags. I won't deny that there are some creepy moments. Some of the twists near the end don't entirely pan out, but in the right hands they may have. It just was a decent concept that didn't work half as well as it could have. So, Orphan's getting a C from me.
Joe?
Well, one thing I definitely have to say this film has going for it is originality. I thought that it was a really cool idea, and for the most part, I definitely think that the element of creepiness and the disturbing nature of the film are kind of what hold it up a little bit more for me. Just, the main character is just kind of oozing with this evil essence that you really can't get past, and I really think that she really stands out for that. However, there is a lot of bad writing. There really is. Like, the parents in this movie, and pretty much every adult in this movie, I believe Justin said, really are pretty much oblivious, and it just kind of makes you think that this girl is superhuman or something with just all the capabilities that she has, and you wonder, okay, what's wrong with her? And the twist of the film, while I did think it was good, I didn't see it coming, it kind of made me question things and kind of contorted the motivations of the character, and I wasn't really sure where she stood despite possible insanity or just being pure evil or whatever the twist may be. I won't give it away, but it kind of brought more questions that I thought took away from consistencies in the film that I thought had been established. But I really thought it was original concept. I thought it was very creepy. I thought the acting was pretty good for the most part, and I did genuinely like the twist. I'm going to give it a C+.
I definitely liked the twist as well. I thought it was clever. I definitely didn't see it coming, and it actually kind of made a lot of sense. Well, I wouldn't have picked it out of a lineup, but it did make sense with the rest of the story. This is another example, though, of a movie where one or both of the parents, usually it's one against the other. In this case, Vera Farmiga sees something is off, and she's sort of getting the notion that maybe Esther's not all she's cracked up to be, and her husband isn't getting it. She's telling him that there's a problem with Esther, and Esther's doing this, and the husband just is like, well, no, she's fine, like nothing's wrong, even though there's all this mounting evidence. And that is one of my biggest horror cliches that I just cannot stand. And one of the few comedic things in A Haunted House earlier this year was sort of a play off of that, when the one person is like pointing out all these flaws and things that are going wrong, and the other person, oh no, I don't understand either, but that's fine, nobody cares, And that's sort of how this was in The Orphan. Vera Farmiga kept just trying to hit everybody over the head with, dude, something's wrong with Esther, what's going on here, like, this is not the daughter I signed up for. And just no one seems to be listening or understanding, even when there's piles of evidence.
Dan, didn't they basically adopt her after one visit? I mean,
yeah, I think they did.
The lack of investigation is kind of on
no
them.
investigation.
Hence the bizarre moments for me.
Like, what?
Yeah, there was a lot of things that would not have happened in
life,
the real world that took place here. Yeah, for me, I definitely agree that the acting was okay. Vera Farmiga is one of my favorite recent actresses, but the dialogue here is just terrible. It doesn't really flow very well. It's not natural. There was definitely some good here. I did like the twist at the end, but overall, I was not much of an Orphan fan, and it gets a C from me. All right, our final movie is About Schmidt. We're going through the Oscar nominee list from A to Z, and we're up to film number 3, About Schmidt. It was nominated for Best Actor in 2002. This was Jack Nicholson, of course, and Kathy Bates was up for Best Supporting Actress. They didn't win either. However, it did win a Golden Globe for Screenplay, and Jack did win the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Motion Picture Drama, of which he said, quote, "I'm a little surprised. I thought we made a comedy," end quote. Classic Jack. Joe, why don't you take the lead on this one?
Well, basically, Jack Nicholson stars as Walter Schmidt, this recently retired senior citizen who begins to look back on his life and wonder if it really has as much meaning as he originally thought it did. And following the sudden death of his wife of 42 years, he goes on a journey of self-discovery to basically find out what in his life has meaning. And the two primary plot points follow him trying to save his daughter from a horrible marriage, which she is bent on following through, and a small little donation to a young African child after viewing something on the television. And I'm just going to say right now that I was really glad this one came up because I love this movie. I just think it's fantastic. It's one of the greatest dramas I've ever seen. It also is, I guess, one of the best dark comedies I've ever seen, if you could really call it that. But it's just one of Jack Nicholson's best performances. The writing is great. The themes in this film that are explored are done in a way that isn't too heavy-handed, and it really smoothly is intertwined with just basically these everyday life aspects that I think many people would question looking on Schmidt's situation. And it really is just a great story, and it has really dynamic characters, really strong lines, and if you haven't seen it, definitely go see it. And I will say that this movie builds up to be really one of the most depressing films you'll ever see, but there is this little ray of sunshine towards the end of the film that makes the whole thing worth seeing. And really, I don't think it's any surprise, but it got an A+ for me when I saw it originally, and it still holds up. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Justin and I were both new to this one, and it's interesting that I felt the same exact way last week about a Boy. I had seen it before, I loved it, I was glad it came up in the A to Z. For me, this was just a fantastic Nicholson performance. I don't think anybody would deny that. But I think the film itself, it's a great study of human behavior and societal norms. There's a great little part towards the beginning where in a voiceover, Jack lists all of the things about his wife that he can't stand. And that, to me, rings so true of old married couples. You know, I know my grandparents were exactly like that. They would never say it to each other, but it was just like, you know, after 50 years of marriage, just every little thing drives you crazy. I love that they put that in there. He is a very likable character once we get to know him. Clearly he is a classic older man curmudgeon. And again, my grandfather was the exact same way. But at his core, he loved his family and he loved his life, even if he had a gruff exterior. And that was this character completely. For me, it's an A. I think upon maybe another viewing, it could easily get an A+. But I was glad this one came up so early, too. It was really, really great to see it.
Going off of your comment about it being a dark comedy, I would absolutely say it is, especially in terms of him basically poking fun at his own life. This is one of those movies that you really have to appreciate it for its subtlety. It decides it wants to show so much more than telling, and it pays off. I actually paid note of this very early on. In most instances of a Jack Nicholson movie, most people will end up having Jack Nicholson play Jack Nicholson and have him act crazy for the next hour and a half. This time around, we don't hear him say a single word for 7 minutes, and it pays off so well. You really understand this character as a curmudgeon, as a man that almost seems to be lamenting his own life and trying to find meaning in a life that hasn't really been that fulfilling. I thought the cinematography, like I said, was phenomenal. I thought it told so much more than actual dialogue. I thought the storyline was very original. I thought it was funny, maybe a little depressing, but it held my attention. Admittedly, it's not going to be for everyone. There are some things that aren't easy to watch. There are some things that seem a little bizarre, but they also bring true to life, which isn't always easy either. I have no problem giving About Schmidt an A, which for me would be an easy A+.
Yeah, Justin does not give A+, so it was on the high end of A then.
He's cool right
on the very, very high end of A.
And it is interesting because it came out the same year as About a Boy, so they were both up, I guess, at the Globes for screenplay, but at the Oscars, I am surprised that About Schmidt was not nominated for Best Screenplay at the Oscars. That is shocking. I mean, I'm glad About a Boy was. You know, there were a few other movies, obviously. You know, Chicago was up that year for just about everything, but the writing in this movie is so good. And I loved, you mentioned the African boy that he sort of adopted or whatever. Yeah, Ndugu. And I loved that the voiceovers came in letters to him. And obviously, he's an African boy, and I pointed this out early in the movie. I said, if he can't read or write, he's 7 or whatever, living in this impoverished country.
But it's not really for him.
But it's not for him. It's for Walter to get his stuff out, and it's cathartic for him. He needs to do it, and as older guys of that generation are known to do, you know, he's not just gonna write in a diary or whatever. He decided to do it in that forum, and it was such a smart choice. Yeah, what a great movie. I'm so glad we got to watch it this week.
Honestly, in terms of the perfect movie, I really think it's one of those few that comes close to it. It's just, it's perfect.
Yeah.
I really think it is.
I'm very glad we ended on that upbeat note. We had a lot of not so great movies this week, some that divided us a little bit.
Basically, through all the horror, Schmidt saved us.
Yeah, Schmidt saved it all. Joe, what's the latest on your YouTube channel?
Latest on my YouTube channel, I recently saw the Justice League animated feature, The Flashpoint Paradox. It was kind of covering a storyline that came out a couple of years ago. I thought that it did a pretty good job. It's entertaining. Some of the character designs are a bit off, but overall I enjoyed it. And if you're a fan of DC Comics and you're not too familiar with the most recent storylines, I say go check it out because it was kind of important in reestablishing the new universe. But that's pretty much the most recent video I did on my channel.
Okay, and that's Merlin Boss on YouTube.
That is correct.
And you can also find us on YouTube, of course, at Film Fanatics. We have a Facebook group, Film Fanatics, with an exclamation point at the end of it. And then also our Twitter, which is at Film Fanatics Pod. And we thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you back here next week on Film Fanatics.